everybody, and thank you for joining our James Cook University webinar series. My name is Professor Stephen Boyle, and I'm going to be your MC for this evening's webinar. I am also the Dean of the College of Business Law and Governance, and that's where our tourism program sits and all of our amazing tourism academics as well. But first of all, I'd like to acknowledge the Australian Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander peoples as the first inhabitants of this country and pay my respects to the traditional owners and elders past and present of the land on which we stand today. In the spirit of reconciliation, I also acknowledge the valuable contribution that Australian Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander peoples continue to make to James Cook University and to the broader community. But before we go on, I just want to do some housekeeping before we get started. So if you have any questions during the presentation, you'll see that there's a Q&A box in your Zoom control panel. So please type your questions into that as we go through the presentation, and then I'll be able to address these and work with Gianna and ask the questions at the end of the presentation, and then hopefully she'll be able to answer them and we can have the conversation at the end. So make sure you type your questions as we go, and then once we get to the end, we will go through those questions at the end. So without further ado, our speaker tonight is JCU Professor of Tourism, Gianna Moscardo, from the College of Business Law and Governance. She holds qualifications in applied psychology and sociology and joined JCU back in 2002. Her recent project areas include evaluating tourism as a tool for economic development in rural regions, tourist experience analysis, cross-cultural issues in tourism, designing effective tourist interpretation, and tourist storytelling. Current research is focused on the understanding heritage interpretation in tourist settings, tourist storytelling, and using quality of life as a way to investigate tourism impacts and community development. So please welcome Professor Gianna Moscardo. Over to you.
Thank you, Stephen. And thank you everyone who has joined us this evening. From where I sit, I can't see you, so but I know that you're out there, and as Stephen said, when we finish the presentation, we may be able to have more direct interaction. Before I move to the first slide of my presentation, I'm just going to tell you that it's going to be silent for about 45 seconds. So I'm going to show you an animation from a 1944 psychology experiment, and it has no sound, and it runs for about 90 seconds, and I'm going to be quiet for the first 45 seconds of that, and then I'll start to talk. What I want you to be doing while we're all sitting in silence, and that seems a strange way to start a webinar, but that's what we're going to do tonight. I want you to be thinking about what you're seeing on the screen in front of you. So Hyder and Simmel asked people in 1944 to watch this 90-second animation. It was state-of-the-art technology back then, and asked them to think about how they would explain what they saw to someone else who hadn't seen it. So that's what I would like you to do for 45 seconds, is to watch it and think about how you would describe what you're seeing to someone else who had not seen it. So let's get started on that. So we're almost at the end, and I can start to tell you how people began to respond to this. And I think some of you will be in the same vein. So what is clear is that the evil large triangle has trapped the young circle inside, and the small triangle has to come and rescue her. We're not sure if the big triangle is actually her father who doesn't want her to run away with the little triangle, or whether it's an abusive husband and he's rescuing her from a domestic violence situation. But in a second, they've escaped. And man, is he angry. Let's just see how angry he gets. Whoa, broken the house completely. So that was meant to be an experiment to determine the extent to which we can't help but create a story. So the majority of people back in 1944 and in every subsequent repeat of this experiment, and it's one that's commonly done with as an introductory practical activity for undergraduate psychologists, and the same results happen. So for nearly 80 years, people have been doing exactly the same thing across different cultural groups. We create characters out of the three core geometric shapes, and we put together a narrative, a story around what is going on there. Not everybody does, but the vast majority of people interpret what they're seeing as a story. Oops, need to go to the very next one. Okay, now we come to 2018, and similar projects, experiments in psychology, but we've changed our technology. Now we're able to use fMRI scans to try and work out exactly what's going on inside people's brains. So the red-orange pieces that are highlighted on those scans of a human brain in front of you are indicators of brain activity. So that is increased electrical activity inside people's brains. So the psychologists studying the cognition of stories in the last few years have moved over to using these. Now, the pictures across the bottom are of a person telling a story. So that is the storyteller on the bottom with the different areas of the brain being shown. And they are typically telling a story about something that they personally have experienced. And one of the classic things was that they've used two common stories are incidents where you've done really well in a social sports team. So you scored the winning goal for your social football team, or you made the best shot in your mixed pairs doubles tennis tournament. So you've performed better than you expected under difficult circumstances. And that's the story you're telling. Or the second story is you've encountered a dangerous animal of some sort while walking through a natural environment. So a snake on a trail, or a bear if you're in North America. Now, the person on the bottom, we can see that except for the middle panel, the areas of the brain that light up between the person telling the story and the person on the top who is listening to the story are very, very similar. The difference in the middle is that the person telling the story is remembering the physical motor actions that the person on the top, the listener, the audience for the story, isn't active. But what is really quite fascinating from a psychology point of view is how much more of the frontal lobes are lit up in the listener than in the teller. And for some psychologists, they will refer to this as that is imagination happening. That is a sort of dreaming while you're actually awake, because what we believe is going on is that the listener is imagining themselves in the story. They are starting to fill out with their imagination the other aspects of the story that they're not being told. And for many years, psychologists have pondered what makes us distinctively human and different to other animals. For a long time, we thought it was awareness of self. And now we know that many, many animals have awareness of self. So we threw that one out. Then we thought maybe it was our ability to make tools to help us in meeting our challenges, but then we found out lots of other animals do that too. Then it was our ability to communicate with each other and therefore coordinate collective action. And it turns out no, other animals, in fact, not only do it, but for example, whales possibly do it better than we do. So increasingly, the people studying storytelling and psychology are talking about this ability to imagine, that stories may be what distinguishes us from the rest of the animal kingdom. Our ability to imagine ourselves on the trail encountering a dangerous animal, and therefore our ability to learn vicariously how we might react to that and what that might be like, is what has given us a major evolutionary advantage over the fact that we don't have scales and venom and claws and big teeth and strength and speed. And so despite the change in the technology that they used, the message is still the same. Stories are really fundamental to being a human. I'm going to let you read through the slide, because while you're doing that, I'm going to tell you a story related to the picture that you see in this slide. That is Ye Shen. And Ye Shen is the heroine of a Chinese fairy tale, a very old Chinese fairy tale. So Ye Shen was a young girl in a village, much loved by her wealthy merchant father, particularly as her mother died when she was very young. All the villagers thought she was beautiful and kind and hardworking and very virtuous. Her father remarries and brings home a stepmother and a stepsister. Unfortunately, he dies not long after that. And that leaves Ye Shen at the mercy of what turns out to be quite an unpleasant stepmother and a very unpleasant stepsister. And they essentially make her a slave for them. And some of you will have already picked up the similarities in the story I'm telling to stories that you know. She's very isolated and sad, and she befriends a magical fish in the local pond. We'll skip a few details, but essentially the local king, don't know if king's the right word, but that's the translation that they use in English, decides his son needs to get married and sets up a feast at the village to allow his son to meet the local eligible girls. The spirit of the fish comes down to help Ye Shen to attend the prince's ball, creating a beautiful green and gold dress from the water of the pond and a pair of magical golden slippers from the fish's magical golden scales. So off she goes to the party. Things go wrong and she has to run away early, leaving behind one of the golden slippers. The prince decides he's going to send his staff out with the slipper to find the girl it fits. And after a little bit more bad behavior from her stepmother and sister, he indeed finds her. They fall in love, and she is rewarded for her virtues by becoming the princess. And of course, for virtually everyone that's listening, this sounds very familiar. It is, in the European tradition, the story of Cinderella. But I'm confident will sound familiar for most people, because it is one of 3 fairy tales that have been found in various forms of oral history or written records in every continent except Antarctica. Everywhere humans have been, going back several thousand years, there is evidence that they have their own version of Cinderella. This one is one of the earliest written fairy tales. The scrolls that were discovered were dated back to 700 BC. So we're heading up towards 3,000 years ago. We know that the story of Cinderella was being told to small children in China, but we also know it was being told to small children in Africa, in Southern America, throughout Europe. The other 2 stories are Beauty and the Beast and the blacksmith selling his soul to the devil for skill and riches. Those 3 stories seem to have, it's still not clear whether they were shared or whether they arose independently. And there are many who argue independently, because they all have a very clear moral that is important for small communities to continuously, collectively reinforce amongst their younger members. So when I'm telling you a story, what am I talking about? Well, Ye Shen had exactly the sorts of things that we need in a story. They're a set of causally connected events. There's an unexpected or challenging thing that happens. So her father dies. She also has an opportunity to go to the ball, but she has challenges getting there. Her stepmother won't let her go. It describes the emotional reactions of a key character or set of characters to these events. And we're especially interested in stories in explaining their decisions, the choices they make, the actions they take to respond to that, and the consequences of these decisions. And finally, a story must mean to be entertaining. It may well have an educational component, a moral, a lesson to be learned, but from very early origins, as far as we can tell, storytellers were much prized for their ability to be entertaining and to generate an emotional response or reaction from their audience. So, why is a professor of tourism talking about stories in tourism? Well, it's been one of the strands of research I've been looking at for about 12 years now, though it kept popping up in some earlier work I was doing on other topics and didn't pay that much attention to it till I finally decided that it kept popping up enough that it required more direct attention. And I would say to you, tourism destinations, the places that sell themselves as regions you should go and visit, are essentially collections of actual and potential stories. That's not really the way the older school business strategic planning kind of approach, consumer behavior kind of approach tends to talk about them as providing goods and services. And there's been much debate about what is it that separates tourism as a form of consumption from other things like shopping or going to the movies or home improvements, etc. And I think it's the importance of stories. So destinations are collections of stories, and tourists travel to experience stories and especially to tell them to others. And while I think this has always been the case, two forces, the rise of tourists from Asia and the Middle East, where storytelling is much more overtly recognized and applauded and sought after in their cultures, and the rise of social media has made stories much, much more explicit in the minds of everyone, but especially tourists. So across the bottom, I want to give you some examples of where we've seen really spectacular and impressive results when we look at storytelling linked to tourism. So the Bronx Zoo's cobra. In 2011, the Bronx Zoo in New York in the United States put out a press release saying that they had lost their cobra. Within, I think it was about 18 hours, the Bronx Zoo cobra had her own Twitter account. To this day, no one will say who does that on her behalf, because obviously she has difficulty typing. But within 24 hours, she had 30,000 followers. Within 48 hours, she had more than 150,000 followers. And still to today, she has just under 142,000 followers on Twitter. And those first week, it became like a soap opera, an adventure serialized, following her around all different parts of New York City. It went viral and was much loved by very many people. But the key point from a tourism business point of view is Bronx Zoo saw an immediate increase and a sustained increase in visitation to the zoo. And that increase was in a particular market, younger people who had sort of left home but hadn't yet started their own family. They are traditionally not people that go to zoos and museums quite as much as other groups, but the Bronx Zoo Cobra on Twitter reached out to them and told them a story that apparently captured their attention and their imagination and encouraged them to go and visit the zoo. So even though the Bronx Zoo Cobra was found within a few days and still lives happily there, her Twitter account continues and she continues to live life large online. In the middle, we have Izzy B, and Izzy B lives on Magnetic Island, just off the coast of Townsville. And Izzy B lives with her veterinary mother, and together with her parents, she helps them to find, rehabilitate, and release to the wild injured or orphan koalas. Izzy B, and quite a few of you may know this already if you have small children, Izzy B's Koala World is one of the top 10 children's shows in Australia on Netflix. So Izzy B is into her 3rd season on Netflix. It's hard to get stats out of Netflix because they talk about millions of hours of views, and Izzy B's episodes are about 25 minutes long. What we know is that last year she racked up more than 3 million hours of views in Australia alone. And from tracking back through the statistics in Netflix, there's probably at least that many views for the rest of the world, and very probably far more. So if we think about 2 episodes an hour, essentially Izzy B in any given year is getting around about 12 million views, but not just a click and a like, kids watching and engaging and seeing Izzy B spend her life on Magnetic Island. And for small children, it's very, very entertaining. That sort of reach is far beyond anything a tourism business or destination like Magnetic Island could ever gain through any other formal channel at all. And then at the end, we start to see the power of tourists traveling to experience stories. And that is a group there, a picture from a group from northern Croatia up across the sea from Venice in Italy. So up in that part of Europe. Croatia is a major tourist destination in Europe. And it's a group called Istria in Spirit. And they were actually started as a community-funded youth employment scheme. And so they didn't start out to be tourism business people. They started out as a community group who got money to try and find ways to improve youth unemployment in that part of Croatia. They decided that they would give them all training in performing arts, and they would take the opportunity to try and make money out of tourists at the local resorts telling local stories. So they wanted to capture and retain local culture through the local stories and offer opportunities for young people to gain employment that did not necessarily mean cleaning rooms in hotels or carrying bags. Not that they are necessarily problematic jobs, but they were not long-term careers that would help these youngsters build their wider sets of skills. Anyway, it was a huge success, and it has continued to grow. And they went from offering 2-story performances to now offering an almost unlimited, the structured ones that were available this summer. They had 18 different options, plus you can organize for groups of various sizes, more personalized versions. They didn't slow down during COVID because Croatians, domestic tourists, took them up with great enthusiasm, and their employment has spread far beyond youngsters to actually include a wide range of the locals. So they've got a lot more, they've won a lot of awards, and they continue to grow very well. So they show us, if you like, the 2 sides of the applied story world. One is the use of stories to capture the interest of tourists. And we can do that in a number of ways, and that's already happening to some extent. So we can use a well-known story in our tourism promotion. The picture on the left there is from it's the intersection, it's the crossroads of US highways 49 and 61 and in Clarkdale, Mississippi. And this is another version of the devil selling his soul to the the blacksmith selling his soul to the devil. Robert Johnson, a jazz guitarist, is supposedly told a story that late one night in this crossroads in the middle of the Mississippi Delta, he met the devil and he sold his soul to the devil to become the best jazz guitarist on the planet. And he then went on to a great deal of fame and fortune. Unfortunately, not for very long. He had a short life. But this well-known story, it became a place where blues and jazz fans would arrive at the crossroads. It's the setting for this story that they all desperately want to at least believe in a little bit. And so a thriving and successful locally based tourism industry has popped up around those crossroads. That means that if you're into destination marketing, you really would want to be thinking, do I know all the stories of my place? So do we know what stories are out there that the rest of the world may actually know about, but we don't necessarily know about? Because when it first started, the locals there were completely bewildered as to why these people were turning up. It wasn't a story told locally, but it was a story of their place. We can also tell stories as promotional tools, as in we make up a story. So on the other side of the slide, you'll see one of the advertisements from the Marriott Hotel's short film series, To Bellman. That's the movie poster for To Bellman 2. They have released To Bellman 3 and are working on To Bellman 4. It was meant to be a viral online advertising campaign. We're going to do a 30-minute short film in which we pay actors to take the roles of two bellmen and a Marriott hotel who go on these insane adventures in the region around the hotel to solve a problem that a guest has. It did take off, but it did more than take off. It actually generated its own fan base and followers, hence why they're moving towards To Bellman 4. And each of the subsequent short films have been set in a different hotel, but now the hotels have themed events where people who are fans can come and meet the actors and see where the short films were. Essentially, Marriott has created an ad that has become its own little cinematic universe, but it's generated a lot of additional income for them. And it's because it's such a compelling story. Each of the films tells quite a compelling story. It has all those features that I talked about. We can tell the stories of other tourists, and I will just note a quick little aside there. I won't go down that track because that's another webinar, is that social media influencers have become very fashionable in the world of tourism marketing. But increasingly, as we do research, we find that likes and shares do not translate terribly well into people actually choosing to visit your destination. It doesn't work quite the same way as cosmetics and fashion, in that people can follow a travel influencer and enjoy what they do, but not necessarily want to go where they've been. The distinction that is emerging from some of the research that's happening in Europe is that those that are good, very pretty, and put in pretty pictures get likes and shares, but they don't convert them into actual tourists in quite the same way. And then the fourth option is to sell your destination as a place where they can begin to experience a story. So some of the internationally award-winning tourism destination promotion campaigns have been from places like Abu Dhabi in 2016, invited viewers of their advertising to create their own story in the You're Extraordinary campaign. In 2018, Booking.com had a whole series, campaign. These are our stories, what will be yours? Book your next story with us. And the Korean Tourist Organization has very recently begun a campaign inviting visitors to let your story begin. So we can also sell our destinations as offering our tourists the opportunity to create and experience their own personal story. And that's what I have been working with some colleagues elsewhere to really focus on, is to move away from stories in promotion to stories at the core of the tourist experience. And Storytelling has always been part of tourism. That's what guides do. They tell stories. So do museums and historic houses. They are places built around telling stories. And in that, the tourist can be an audience. Our first picture there on the top of the three images, these are all again from Istria in Spirit. We see the tourists as an audience, as a classic audience. They're watching a story being performed in front of them. Over on the right-hand side of the slide, though, you can move to being an extra. So you move out of the audience, you become part of the performance, admittedly not in any control of it and not changing the story, but you're in it. You're dressed up, you're given props, you're given things to do within the story. So you can move to being an extra. But increasingly very clever tourism businesses are moving towards story creating where the tourist is the star. So that's the third image there. You can work with the Istria in Spirit team and they will create a story performance event in which you are the star as the tourist. You and your group, or you and your family, or you alone can be the star. And are we moving towards the tourist as actually the creator, writer, producer of their own stories? Yes, we are, but not so obviously amongst the tourism industry. That's actually being done by mobile app people. So the story creating where the tourist starts to gather much more control over the story that they experience has been very enthusiastically embraced by app designers. And that's the high-tech extreme. So the example there is the Stockholm Sound Drone. It's an application you load onto your mobile phone when you visit Stockholm in Sweden. If you set it up, so that it can follow your location. As you move around the city, it will alert you by sending messages and notifications to your phone when you are close to a site connected to something to do with music. So it's music themed, and it's all music from ancient Swedish music through classical to more contemporary forms and all genres of music. You can focus it on a particular time period. You can focus it on a particular type of music that you're interested in. And it will alert you when you are close to a place that has a music story, and it tells you those stories. It either tells you that through the phone, you can listen to someone telling you the story, or it tells you where to go to find a local to tell you the story. So you can also be directed to local people who will meet up with you and share the story with you. And it's got a gamification element where you collect points the more of these stories you listen to, and you can use those points to access special performances, backstage areas while you are in Stockholm. So that is not an uncommon app. Lots of those exist for many places in the world. But you don't have to have an app. You can go low tech. And one of the companies that does this, it says it's stable again, license to take guided national parks. So the image on the right of the screen is the Milford track coming down from McKinnon Pass back down to the last lodge that you stay on when you walk the Milford track. What they do is they spend several hours on the first day before you start the trek properly, talking to all the guests in their group. So they usually have 5 to 6 guides, depending on the number of guests in the group. And the guides go around and they talk to every one of their trekkers and they find out who they're here with, have they been before, and what they hope to get out of the experience. What are they looking for? So for example, on the group that I went with, we had a newly formed Korean Olympic rowing team who had never rowed before as a team. Individually, they were impressive, but they'd been put together. And they were there to figure out how to bond as a team. So the story they were looking for was to create a new and successful team for this Olympic event. There was also a couple where the husband had just survived a very frightening, I imagine, and extensive cancer treatment for cancer, but he had come out the other end, and he was doing it to demonstrate that he'd gotten back to his level of fitness, and he was challenging himself. And this was the way he was going to show his family that he had really overcome this cancer as a challenge to his well-being. And then there was a very rich executive who wanted the opportunity, who had recently had his wife of many years leave him, and he was having a personal crisis, and he thought maybe he needed to spend some time in nature renewing his sense of self so that he could rethink about what he wanted in life. So what the group did was actually alter the activities that they offered and how they worked with those guests so that they got exactly the setting and the opportunity to have the story they wanted. And in the celebratory dinner at the end of the trek, they actually told the stories of a selection of their guests, and they presented their trek as that story for what they were looking for. So you can do it with no technology at all, very little infrastructure. You can just do it with very good staff. So we start to come towards the end, and let's talk a little bit about the research that some of the more recent studies. So whose story? We know that you can tell stories of places, factual and fictional. We can tell stories of locals. We can tell stories of the tourism businesses and their staff, and we can tell stories about tourists themselves, or stories that tourists themselves can see themselves as part of. So one of the projects that I did in South Africa with the assistance of colleagues at the University of Pretoria, we looked at visitors to Kruger National Park, the major game park in South Africa. Wonderful experience and an amazing environment. No stories though, they don't tell stories. And we compared visitors, some of whom did both, some of them did not. We compared them to visitors who went on a tour of Soweto, the township that provided all the staff to work for the people in Johannesburg during the apartheid era. And it was the site of a great many important incidences related to the struggle against apartheid in South Africa. And that is nothing but stories. And that's taken by local guides, and they tell their personal story. They tell the stories of the places, but they also often engage their groups in activities so that tourists can begin to build their own stories. So what did we find? We found that even though people had good experiences in Kruger National Park, the evaluations for Soweto were significantly and substantially better. People were more satisfied, felt that it had been better value for money, felt that they would return, felt that they were reported that they were much more likely to seriously and strongly recommend this to anyone else that was going to South Africa. They also displayed more detailed memory for their experiences, so they were more likely to be able to tell us the name of their guide. It's kind of interesting. Everyone that went to Soweto remembered the name and the address or the contact details for their guide. Nobody in Kruger remembered their guide apart from maybe a Christian name. So you can say, I recommend this guide, but if you don't remember their name, it's not going to be as effective as if you can actually give their contact details to someone else. And they were more likely to engage in a lot of post-visit action linked to improving their knowledge of the history of the apartheid in South Africa. So overall, the results show the closer the story gets to the tourist's experience and the fact that it's told by a local, and that the story in this case was about one of these universal themes. And all the stories in Soweto were about survival and overcoming adversity and challenging injustice. So two core themes were used in these stories, and it really made a really large difference to the quality of the visitor experience. The second study is a more recent one, and we've been looking at 20 culinary or food tourism experiences around the world. And we have ordered them from highest to lowest in terms of their overall TripAdvisor rankings, in terms of being, they have excellent, very good, good, etc. It's a 5-point scale. So we have 20 of them from all different parts of the world and different sorts of culinary experiences. The thing that distinguishes the top 9 from the rest, again with a significant and substantive gap, a significant drop in people's satisfaction evaluation ratings, is whether or not they tell a story. So the top 9 tell stories, the bottom 11 don't tell stories, and there's quite a gap. The top 3 were the Granville Island Market Foodies Tour in Vancouver, the New Belgium Brewery Tour in Fort Collins in the USA, and the Saigon Culinary Arts Centre Discovery Cooking Class, which is in Ho Chi Minh City in Vietnam. They were the ones that were much more explicitly built around a story. For the first 2, it is about renewal and finding one's true self, with a little bit of comedy thrown in for the New Belgium Brewery. Turns out these guys weren't just marijuana smoking mountain bikers, they really were brewers of outstanding beer sustainably. So we also know that if you use one or more of these themes, your story comes to life in a way that other stories can't do. So we're headed towards the second last slide now. What else have we been looking at? Our latest study with Dr. Karen Hughes from University Queensland is looking at cultural dimensions. But another strand of research that I am currently doing right now is, okay, so what else do we need in a story? We need those universal themes. We need it to have credible, authentic characters that the tourists can see in themselves. Clear causal links, emotional elements, needs to be engaging and immersive. People need to be able to do something either cognitive or physical, and it should have a very clear moral or lesson to be learnt. So if you can fit all of those things into a story and get it told by a local in a way that the tourist can be engaged in it, then you're really going to supercharge your outcomes for your visitors and therefore hopefully your business or community group. And that last project that we're looking at is the cultural dimensions. So yes, we know everybody tells stories, everybody uses stories, everybody loves stories, but different cultures have different what are called literary device traditions, and we're beginning to explore that more. So the people in the world of literature and film critical analysis point out that different cultures structure their stories in different ways. The dominant sort of Northern American kind of Hollywood style one has 3 acts, a single protagonist, a clear resolution. We know that other cultures don't necessarily focus on a single character. It can be a group. They don't need a resolution. They can vary from 4 to 7 acts across different cultures. Not everyone likes us to play with the timeline. So we are doing a cross-cultural study. We've just finished the survey and we'll start analysing that soon. So to bring this all to a close, it's not really the ending of my story researching this as such. It's the ending of sort of like the first few episodes. But I think we've got a few morals, some lessons to be learnt so far, is that stories really are at the heart of tourism. It's not the physical features. We tend to think about whether or not we've got beautiful beaches or great scenery, and that's important. But without stories to bring that to life, it's not going to be as effective as it could be. Stories are really important for connecting locals to tourists, and through locals, connecting tourists to places. We really should be using stories that are already out there, and we really need to move more towards co-creation or creation than storytelling. And that's all I really wanted to share with you tonight. So I'm going to stop sharing and let Stephen see what's going on in the Q&A.
Thanks, Gianna. Yeah, so there is a question in the Q&A. So if anyone else has a question, feel free to type away. This question is asking about, to what extent does cognitive bias in a listener inhibit the effectiveness of storytelling? And how can this be overcome by the storyteller to optimize the impact?
All right. Not my research, but there's quite a lot of research in psychology to show that stories are a great way to turn off cognitive bias. That when we believe someone is trying to persuade us, when we believe that it is actually their intention to persuade us, we begin counter-arguing. So that's where, if we already believe something, we actually strengthen that up in response to someone trying to tell us something different. But if you believe the story, if the story is very credible and you get engaged and immersed in the story, people switch off that counter-arguing function. And as long as it's not very preachy, as long as it's not so absolutely 100% clear that they're trying to sell you something, if instead they get caught up with the characters and the flow of the story, they are actually more open to the lesson. So that's been a consistent finding. So actually a good story where the lesson is in there but not overt can actually be a very powerful persuasive tool that people can use. So I think that answers that one. Did I have a second part, Stephen?
No, just how do you overcome to optimize the impact of the story? But I think that's yeah. This another question here. There's quite a few measures supporting development of tourism business. What Queensland, Australian, or other support measures support story development? And thank you for the presentation, by the way. Right. So what can we do to support story development and
I guess that's where I'm starting to go. One of the reasons that attracted me to work in an area like tourism and to end up in a college like business is that we have a very strong focus in our research on practice outcomes, on trying to learn and understand something so we can provide advice to be it businesses or governments or communities to improve something. And that's where I'm starting to talk to some of our policy makers that we need to be maybe taking some of the money that's put into tourism development. At the moment, you can apply for grants to build something, extend a trail, add something to your accommodation place. And I'm thinking that maybe, talking already to some of the local destination marketing organizations, not a great deal of luck yet, because they're still thinking about the idea, but saying that maybe what we should be doing is doing something more like the Istria in Spirit. Let's see if we can partner with the arts, performing arts world to actually develop more ideas and get local communities engaged in actually developing more stories, either around existing ones or creating new stories. So, and it's kind of interesting, Indigenous tourism businesses, that's explicitly how they build that. And from some other research that we did a little while ago, that is received very, very well by tourists. That's one of the things that they consistently talk about, that this was a great story and we experienced a great story. So we do have good examples of being able to do it. And I think, yes, we can begin to lobby that a bit more, but we shall see. We are going to start writing a book now. So we will see what happens.
And then on a slightly different sort of tack, looking at attractions and destinations, is it better to cast a wider net and create a number of stories to attract different market segments? Or is that going to cloud the sort of the bandwidth?
No, I had this argument with Paul Victory a few years ago, who is in charge of the SeaLink ferry services around the country. And he listened to a short presentation. He said, "So what's my one story?" And I said, "No, you don't want one story. You actually want a range of stories to, in fact, be able to appeal to a range of different audiences, but also to recognize that destinations are complex and they have different stories. So we don't end up with a single story dominating the way a place is presented. But what you need to have is a narrative theme that connects them. So you want to start building your stories somewhat like, maybe not as quite so overtly money oriented as something like Disney has done with the sort of Star Wars universe. They're taking, there's a single story runs through it, but now they're giving us backstories of characters and exploring other worlds that are mentioned in passing in the main story. So they're creating this whole story world and spin-off stories. And I think destinations could do that, but they would do it more around a theme that matters to the locals. So if we were looking at a destination like Magnetic Island, where my colleague Laurie Murphy and I have done some work, many of the residents want people who visit Magnetic Island to understand how important sustainability is and how they feel like they are showing you can live an average suburban life in a great physical environment without it really being hard to do to be sustainable. And that would be a theme then. So you could tell many different stories, but they would all in some way be linked back to that theme that matters to the people in the destination.
And continuing on from that, also looking at different ways to connect with different audiences, so different media channels or different social media platforms or different aspects, to get to the different demographic groups that might only, look in particular spaces rather than.
Yes, yeah, absolutely. I do know that when we get into smaller, more rural, regional destinations, the sort of technology stuff starts to become a little bit more challenging because we don't have the mobile coverage in many places. But so we need to have them told in different ways. And that was really what grew by telling a story. So absolutely different mediums. Some tourists also are happy to be in the audience and then to retell good stories. So we don't always need to push all of them into creating, but increasingly people are wanting to create something unique to them because they do want to share it, usually through their social media platforms. And the only way to make it stand out is for it to be something unique and interesting. So yeah, absolutely a range from low tech to high tech, and a range of different channels there as well.
And we've got a reach out from TTNQ Indigenous Experiences as well to say, let's get in touch. So we've got their details and we'll certainly pass them on.
Excellent. Yeah.
And yes, the question is there a recording of this? Yes, there is a recording of this. We are recording this. This will go up onto YouTube, and all the participants and those that registered to participate but may not have been able to get in will be sent an email with the link to the site, to the YouTube site. And yes, there is, as you were talking about technology, you did start to freeze up on us, so that's okay. I think there's a comment there about the technology, but that's all right. And I've just got one. Oh, there we go. Is this, you talked about, like, watching on Netflix or something like that, and there's a few examples of people watching things on television or reading of books as well, and then wanting to go to those locations. Yes. This is potentially sort of just an extension of those sorts of things, where people wanted to go and visit somewhere in England where they watched Downton Abbey, and they want to go and experience those sort of experiences as well. So I think it's somewhat of an extension of those. We've experienced the story. Now we
Mhm.
want to actually experience that place in real life, I think, as well.
Yeah, and there's certainly been a lot of evidence to support that. It's not quite as strong as people hope it will be from the sort of super high profile popular culture ones. But when you start, there has been some interesting work done in Denmark for some reason, where they started to ask people as part of their sort of a survey of people coming into the country, what stories did they already know about Denmark that had brought them there, and what they found there. And also there was a small attempt to recreate that study with some students in Mallorca in Spain. What they found was there are so many other stories that may not yet have made it into the sort of streaming TV series and major films that are really very, very resonant amongst visitors. So there are lots more stories about our places sometimes than we realize. We think we need a big movie, but there are some really interesting children's books and other stories out there that people have in their heads that they are driving them and to go to these places.
Mm.
Yeah.
And I think we've got one last question here. Continuing on, how important is it to match the story and the narrative with the images or videos that of the particular market that wants to live that story? So how important is it to match up, story, narrative, market, images?
That's that I don't have an answer to that. That is part of this study where we're looking at the different cultural traditions. We're also asking people to look at the images used by in the marketing by in this case the Australian Tourism Australia for international visitors. And so we're going to see just how well people think they can we build those links to that. So it's a preliminary start on that. And the answer is, I don't know, but I think it could be important, but we're going to go and see if we can start finding out what the answer to that one is. So the answer is, I don't know yet, but we're looking into it. Yeah.
Stay tuned for the next episode.
Yeah.
That's great. Thank you so much, Gianna. I think we're coming to the end now. So I want to thank everyone for attending, and particularly for Gianna to tell us a story about how you tell stories. I think that's really important. There will be another seminar coming up next Thursday at 7 p.m. For Year 12 students. And there'll be a conversation if you know families or yourself, or you've got students in Year 12, or people with the students in Year 12. We're going to have other students that are university students coming to talk about their experience transitioning from high school to university and giving their top tips for success. So it might even be useful for other young university students to come and hear some of those things as well. So please pass that information on to anyone you think might be interested. Thank you again. As I said, when you can finish this webinar, there will be a survey that will pop up for you. We would really appreciate if you could quickly take a few minutes to fill in that survey. You'll also get a link when you get to the link to the YouTube video of this event, also to the survey as well. So don't run away straight away, and please take a few minutes to fill in that survey. Thank you all once again very much for coming. Thanks to Gianna and the team behind the scenes that help make these things work really well. We really appreciate everything that the group and the team puts into these things. And I'm going to wish you all a good night and see you next time.
Thank you, Stephen. And bye-bye, everybody.